June 1944. The Pacific horizon shimmered like molten glass. Waves rolled in with a slow rhythm of breathing, their foam breaking gently upon the sand of Santa Monica Beach. Overhead, gulls wheeled and cried as if they alone understood the absurdity of what was happening that morning. Ingrid Schaefer stood barefoot at the water's edge, her prison-issued khaki skirt brushing against her knees, her ankles sinking into the cool sand. Behind her, a row of U.S. Army guards leaned on rifles. Relaxed but alert, the muzzles pointed at nothing in particular. Beyond them stretched the wooden fences and watchtowers of Camp Cook's satellite facility, hastily converted for female German prisoners of war. And beyond that, the ocean. Vast, blue, indifferent. She could hardly believe the sight. The Pacific. She had grown up with the gray waves of the North Sea, hard and cold, where the wind tasted of salt and iron. But this was another world. A world that should have been forbidden. Only 3 months earlier, Ingrid had been a nurse aboard the Bremen Hoffnung, a German hospital ship carrying wounded sailors from occupied France. When the vessel was intercepted off the Azores by an American destroyer, she'd assumed the worst. That she and the others would be treated as spies, perhaps even shot. She had prepared herself for cruelty. That was what propaganda had promised. Americans who despised Germans, who would starve them, beat them, strip them of dignity. Yet when she was taken ashore, she was given food, soap, a clean blanket, and, most bewildering of all, a smile from a young U.S. Navy medic who said softly, "You're safe now, ma'am." Now she stood in sunlight, surrounded by laughter, her fellow prisoners wading into the surf, squealing as the waves hit their legs. 2 MPs helped carry a makeshift volleyball net onto the sand. Someone handed her a towel stamped with U.S. Army Medical Corps. The guards called them the Nurse Girls. They were supposed to swim for 2 hours and then return to camp for chores. A morale program, the officer had said. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment. Someone in Washington had decided that included fresh air and exercise. It felt wrong. It felt impossible. Ingrid stared at her reflection in the wet sand. Her hair bleached by months of sun, her face fuller than she could remember. Her family in Hamburg had written last in February. Her brother Hans was drafted to the Eastern Front. Her mother was surviving on ration bread and powdered milk. And here she was, on a beach in America, standing in paradise while her country burned. She knelt and let the water lap over her hands. It was warm, too gentle to belong to war. A few meters away, Private First Class Leonard Hughes leaned on his rifle and tried not to stare. He was 21, from Kansas, and had never seen German women before. At least, not outside of training films. They didn't look like the enemy. They looked like people. Laughing, splashing, covering their hair with kerchiefs. He exhaled, uneasy. His brother was fighting somewhere in Normandy, maybe dodging bullets fired by men related to these women. The thought twisted in his chest like wire. The guards were under strict orders. No fraternization, no conversation, no gifts. Yet the boundary between captor and captive seemed thinner each week. He had caught one of the nurses humming an American song she'd heard on the camp radio. "Don't sit under the apple tree." He pretended not to notice. At noon, a civilian car pulled up near the checkpoint. Out stepped Dorothy Chen, reporter for the Los Angeles Herald-Express. She was sharp-eyed, her notebook already half-filled. Her brother had been captured in Bataan 2 years ago. No one knew if he was still alive. When she saw the German prisoners laughing under the California sun, something inside her went cold. She raised her camera and took a picture, shutter clicking like a small act of vengeance. That photograph would appear 3 days later under the headline, "Enemy Women Enjoy California Beaches While Americans Die Overseas." The public outcry would be instant. Letters would flood Congress, radio hosts would thunder about betrayal. But none of that had happened yet. For now, it was just a warm afternoon. The sea glittered. The laughter of prisoners mingled with the calls of gulls. Ingrid looked out at the line where the sky met the water. She wondered if, somewhere beyond it, Hamburg still stood. She wondered if her brother still lived. She wondered what her mother would think if she saw her daughter swimming in enemy waters beneath the flag of the nation that was burning her city. Her heart tightened. She waded deeper until the water reached her waist. The sun dazzled her eyes. She wanted to cry, but tears felt ungrateful here, in this gentle world. She whispered to the sea in German, half prayer, half apology. Behind her, Dorothy Chen lowered her camera. For a moment, through the lens, she had seen not enemies, but women. She closed her notebook, uncertain. The story she planned to write no longer felt clean. As the tide began to pull back, Ingrid turned toward shore. Private Hughes averted his gaze, then looked back just once, just long enough to see her raise her hand, not in salute, but in quiet acknowledgement. A human gesture, unscripted, forbidden. He hesitated, then nodded. The ocean shimmered between them like a promise neither could name. The ocean shimmered between them like a promise neither could name. 3 days later, that promise shattered with the crack of newsprint. On page 3 of the Los Angeles Herald-Express, just beneath headlines of Allied advances in France, Dorothy Chen's photograph roared louder than artillery. There they were, German prisoners of war, hair undone, dresses damp from the surf, laughing in the California sun. The headline screamed, "Enemy women on our shores, while our sons bleed in the mud." The backlash was swift, like a prairie fire in high wind. By noon, the switchboard at Camp Cook was jammed. Veterans' wives demanded answers. Gold Star mothers wept in radio interviews. Angry citizens sent scathing letters to senators and mayors. One man from Ohio wrote, "I buried my boy after Anzio, and these women dance in our ocean like it's a holiday." My God, what has this war become? Dorothy Chen sat alone in the Herald-Express archive room, the newspaper still ink-wet in her hands. She hadn't expected such fury. Or maybe she had. Truth be told, she didn't know anymore. What she had seen on that beach, that contrast between Ingrid's soft smile and the brutal image of her own brother, thin as bones in a bamboo cage in Luzon, had torn something in her clean down the middle. Ingrid Schleifer didn't read the article, but the effects reached her like distant thunder. The next Thursday, there was no beach trip, no volleyball net, no warm wind through her hair. The guards avoided eye contact. The mess hall was quieter than usual, and when the camp commander stepped in for evening inspection, his face was stiff with strain. A week later, the official orders came down: suspension of all recreational coastal activity for Category B German female POWs until further notice. Ingrid didn't cry. Not at first. But that night, under her thin army blanket, she felt a kind of ache no illness could explain. The beach had been more than salt water and sand. It had been proof, however fleeting, that war hadn't completely destroyed her soul. That maybe people on opposite sides could still see each other. Not through rifle scopes, but face to face. Now, even that fragile thread had been cut. Across the state, in a Sacramento radio studio, Army Nurse Lieutenant Helen Lambert listened as callers raged. One man shouted that the Geneva Convention should be thrown into the sea with the U-boats. Another insisted that American POWs were starved and tortured while Nazis swim for pleasure. Helen knew that not all Germans were Nazis, She had tended to wounded Allied and Axis soldiers alike in field hospitals. She remembered Ingrid's face from Camp Cook. Earnest, unsure, always asking for extra antiseptic to clean the bandages properly. Ingrid had once asked, in broken English, whether Helen had ever seen snow in spring. It was such a strange, tender question. Helen had answered, yes, once, in Vermont. Then quietly, Ingrid had said, in Hamburg too, before, and left the sentence unfinished. The wounds people carried weren't always visible. That same week, Helen found herself stationed back at Camp Cook on a temporary rotation. She stepped into the infirmary and saw Ingrid sitting by the window, reading an old nursing manual. Her posture was tighter than before, her eyes dimmer. Ingrid, Helen said softly. The German woman looked up. No beach today, she said, smiling without mirth. Helen hesitated, then stepped forward. I know, she whispered. I saw the paper. Ingrid closed the book. Did your brother fight? Helen nodded. Pacific, Tarawa. I haven't heard from him in months. Ingrid lowered her gaze. I'm sorry, truly. The silence between them was heavy, but it held no malice. Only the ache of two women caught in a storm neither of them had made. That night, Helen found Dorothy Chen's article pinned to the staff bulletin board, circled in red. Someone had scribbled on it, "This is why we fight." But was it? The next day, Dorothy received a letter, delivered by hand from Camp Cook's administrative office. It was brief, just 4 sentences, written in Ingrid's unmistakably precise handwriting, the ink careful and black. I saw your photograph in the paper. It is not wrong. You are right to question. But perhaps someday you might also ask why your country gives kindness to those taught to hate you. I did not expect it. It frightened me because it made me see clearly. That is harder than hate. Dorothy folded the letter and stared at it for a long time. She thought of her brother. She thought of the last postcard he'd sent, written in hasty Tagalog to avoid Japanese censors. One line stood out. Don't let anger eat your heart, Mei Mei. What do you do when you see kindness in the eyes of someone taught to be your enemy? What do you do when the world demands you hate, but your heart hesitates? Dorothy didn't know yet. But she wrote back, I took your picture because I was angry. Maybe I still am. But I didn't see hate in your face. I saw a girl who looked free. And I hated that you were allowed to feel that, when my brother never will. Maybe that's not fair. But it's the truth. She never sent the letter. Not yet. But something had shifted. Back in Camp Cook, Ingrid returned to the infirmary. The beach was gone. But she had soap. She had silence. And sometimes she had Helen's voice in the hallway, humming an old American tune about apple trees. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of the ocean. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of the ocean. The weeks passed, and the California coast faded into memory. Like a dream she could almost reach, but never again touch. Ingrid went about her routines with quiet precision, scrubbing instruments in the infirmary, folding gauze, taking temperature logs for the older prisoners who had fallen ill. The monotony kept her sane. The rhythm of work was the only thing left that made sense. But late one afternoon, while cleaning a storage cabinet, she found a small envelope wedged behind a stack of iodine bottles. Her name, Schaefer, Ingrid, was written in unfamiliar English handwriting. Her pulse quickened. She opened it carefully. Inside was a short note, typed, unsigned. Your photograph changed my life. I don't know if it was mercy or madness that put you on that beach. But I need to understand. May I visit the camp? There was no return address, only a postmark. Los Angeles, July 1944. Ingrid didn't need a signature. She knew who had written it. That evening, she stood by the camp fence and looked toward the distant highway, where headlights drifted like fireflies across the dusk. Somewhere beyond that road, Dorothy Chen was waiting, with her questions, her anger, her haunted photograph. Ingrid didn't know if she wanted to be seen again, but part of her did. 2 days later, the camp commander received an official letter from the War Department's Public Information Office. In response to recent press coverage, selected correspondents will be granted supervised interviews with compliant POW subjects. This includes Miss Dorothy Chen of the Herald Express. The guards read the memo aloud in the mess hall. A murmur ran through the women like wind through grass. Some were excited, contact with the outside world. Others were fearful. "The Americans want to humiliate us," one woman whispered. Ingrid said nothing. She knew humiliation already. She also knew truth was rarely simple. When Dorothy arrived, she wore a beige trench coat and carried the same camera from the beach. Her hair was tied back. Her expression was tight, professional. She had prepared herself to meet an idea, not a person, to confront the German nurse, not Ingrid. The camp officer led her through the gates, past the barracks where laundry flapped like pale flags of surrender. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and eucalyptus. At the infirmary door, she paused. Inside, Ingrid was finishing a patient's bandage. Sleeves rolled neatly, her hands steady as clockwork. Dorothy hesitated, then stepped forward. "Fräulein Schaefer?" Ingrid looked up, startled, but not hostile. "You are the reporter." Dorothy nodded. "I am." They stood there, the silence between them heavy with all that had been printed and all that had not. "I did not mean to hurt anyone," Dorothy said quietly. "And I did not mean to look happy," Ingrid replied. The words hung in the air, strange and honest. The interview began formally. Dorothy asked about the Geneva Convention, about medical care, about camp routines. Ingrid answered each question with composure, her English halting but precise. But when Dorothy asked, "Did you ever think it was wrong to swim while others fought?" Ingrid's hands trembled slightly. "Yes," she said, "every minute of it." Dorothy lowered her pen. Ingrid continued. "When I first stepped into that water, I thought maybe God had made a mistake. That perhaps he meant to punish me, but forgot. I was angry at the kindness. Do you understand? It is easier to hate than to feel grateful to someone you are told is evil." Dorothy swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do." For the first time, Ingrid smiled, not out of joy, but recognition. They spoke for almost an hour. About the war, about family, about brothers. When Ingrid described the last letter from Hamburg, her mother writing by candlelight, describing how the city shook under Allied bombs, Dorothy's hand stopped moving on the page. The reporter's own brother had died somewhere in the Pacific just 2 months earlier. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even her editor. In that small room, across a rickety table, the two women found themselves mirrored in grief neither could claim superiority over. When the interview ended, Dorothy stood. "May I take another photograph?" Ingrid hesitated, then nodded. She straightened her collar and faced the window. The afternoon light fell across her face, soft, clean, unguarded. Dorothy pressed the shutter. Click. Not laughter this time. Not defiance. Just the fragile dignity of a woman trying to remain human. That night, Dorothy returned to Los Angeles and developed the film herself. The image emerged slowly under the red light of the darkroom. Ingrid, her eyes half in shadow, her hands clasped as if in prayer. There was no ocean behind her, no sunshine, no evidence of paradise. only quiet endurance. Dorothy stared at the photo for a long time. Then, with trembling fingers, she wrote the caption, "Mercy in Captivity." Her editor refused to print it. "We're not running sympathy pieces for Germans," he barked. "Not when boys are dying in France." Dorothy said nothing. But that night, she mailed a copy of the photograph to Ingrid, hidden between pages of an old medical journal. When the envelope arrived at Camp Cook, Ingrid unfolded the photo and stared at her own face, frozen in silver and shadow. On the back, in small, neat letters, Dorothy had written only 5 words. "I see you more clearly now." Ingrid pressed the paper to her chest. She did not weep. She simply closed her eyes and, for the first time since that day at the beach, allowed herself to feel the tide moving again. Not outside her, but within. She simply closed her eyes and, for the first time since that day at the beach, allowed herself to feel the tide moving again. Not outside her, but within. Summer ripened. The war across the ocean grew more violent. But in Santa Monica, the sea kept breathing its calm rhythm, blind to the fire that devoured cities half a world away. For the women behind barbed wire, the ocean had become rumor, something spoken of in fragments, as though saying its name too loudly would invite punishment. Then, one August afternoon, a new notice was pinned to the camp board. Selected low-risk prisoners may resume supervised recreation along coastal areas under limited parole. The word coastal drew stares. Some prisoners gasped softly. Ingrid stood among them, her heart pounding like a drum in her throat. She didn't speak, didn't dare hope. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her bunk, watching the moonlight crawl along the rafters, thinking of her mother's last letter. It had come 2 weeks ago through the Red Cross. A page of trembling handwriting, the words blurred by tears and ash. "The city burns every night, my child. Your father is gone. Hans is missing. Sometimes I dream of water. Not rain, not the Elbe. Something vast, blue, and kind. I pray you have found it." Ingrid folded the letter until it fit perfectly beneath her pillow. She could not tell her mother that the prayer had already come true, that she had once stood in that water while Hamburg burned. 2 days later, the trucks rolled toward the beach again. There were fewer guards this time, and no journalists, no cameras, just the sound of waves and gulls. The war was still raging, but here it felt distant, almost imaginary. Ingrid stepped from the truck and felt the sand again, warm, familiar, forgiving. She removed her shoes. The Pacific shimmered like a vast mirror, reflecting clouds that seemed to float in eternity. The air smelled of salt and freedom. Around her, the other nurses hesitated, glancing toward the guards as if expecting the dream to vanish. But the sergeant simply said, 2 hours, don't go past the rocks. And that was it. Permission to breathe again. Ingrid walked slowly toward the shoreline, every step stirring ghosts. The first touch of water against her feet sent a shock through her. So pure it hurt. She imagined her mother's hands, calloused and trembling, reaching for buckets during the firestorms in Hamburg. She imagined Hans somewhere in the east, his boots sunk in Russian mud. She wanted to wash away the guilt, but the water only reminded her how impossible that was. Nearby, Private Hughes was watching. He was still stationed at Camp Cook, still uneasy about these beach details. But something about Ingrid's quiet composure drew his attention. She didn't laugh or splash like the others. She stood still, letting the waves climb her skirt, eyes fixed on the horizon as though searching for something only she could see. He remembered the photograph from the paper months earlier, the one everyone in camp had passed around in secret, whispering about those German girls in the surf. That girl, he realized, was standing right there. Flesh and blood. The same one who had looked at him once, as though they shared a secret they could never speak aloud. When the others began to wade out deeper, he walked closer, not too near, just enough that she could hear him over the wind. "Water's warm today?" he said quietly. She turned, startled, then gave a faint smile. "Yes, like the North Sea, but kinder." He nodded, unsure what to say next. Then she added, almost to herself, "It makes me feel unworthy." He frowned. "Unworthy?" Ingrid glanced toward the sky. "Of this, of the sun, the sea, of being alive while others are not." Hughes hesitated. He thought of his brother's photograph, buried in a foxhole somewhere in Normandy, or maybe gone altogether. He knew that same ache. "You don't have to earn the sun," he said finally. "It shines on everyone, even those who wish they didn't deserve it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then softly, "Do you believe that?" He didn't answer, maybe because he wasn't sure. That afternoon, the prisoners returned to camp quieter than usual. No one spoke much during supper. The beach had left them raw, stripped of the numbness that daily chores provided. Ingrid lay awake again that night, the sound of the ocean echoing faintly in her ears. At dawn, she walked outside the barracks and saw Dorothy Chen standing beyond the outer fence, her press badge hidden beneath a plain coat. The reporter wasn't supposed to be there. They met halfway, divided by wire but closer than before. Dorothy spoke first. "I saw you went back to the beach." "Yes," Ingrid said. "They allowed us again." Dorothy's voice trembled slightly. "People are still angry about it. They say it's not right." "Maybe it isn't," Ingrid replied. "But it was necessary." "For what?" "To remember that we're still human." Dorothy stared at her, speechless. Then she said, "I wish my brother had met someone like you." Ingrid lowered her gaze. "Perhaps he did. Perhaps we only meet after the war. Through forgiveness." The guard's whistle broke their silence. Visiting hours were over. Dorothy turned to leave, but Ingrid called softly after her, "Thank you for the photograph." Dorothy smiled faintly. "Thank you for letting me take it." As she walked away, Ingrid felt something shift inside her, not peace, not joy, but a fragile bridge where hatred had once lived. That night, in her bunk, she dreamt of the beach again. But this time, the ocean was not a wound. It was a mirror. She saw her mother's reflection, her brother's shadow, and behind them, the faint outline of Dorothy's camera, capturing not guilt, not pride, but the impossible beauty of being forgiven while still unworthy. Then came September, and with it, silence. No more letters from Hamburg, no more beach outings, no more newspaper clippings passed around like contraband under blankets. The air grew still in California, and the war seemed louder in the quiet. Ingrid rose each day at dawn. She scrubbed floors, distributed medicine, and kept count of gauze rolls. She worked with the efficiency of someone who knew time was not a guarantee. Her movements were precise, her emotions folded deep beneath layers of habit. The others noticed how she no longer lingered near the infirmary window, how her gaze no longer drifted toward the western horizon. They said nothing. War had taught them silence, but Ingrid's silence was different. Inside her, something had shifted. The tide that had once stirred in her chest was no longer rising. It had pooled, still and heavy, like seawater trapped in a basin. Each night she dreamt of walking into the Pacific and dissolving into it, not in death, but in erasure, as if the ocean might take away the weight of being spared. She had not told anyone that her last letter from her mother had included a single line at the bottom, hastily scrawled. "They say the fire took the Western District. I am safe. But your brother, no word." Hans. her younger brother. The boy who once tied her hair in knots when they played soldiers in the orchard. The boy who said he would never hurt anyone, but went anyway when the Reich called. Now missing. Maybe buried in Russian snow, maybe scattered ash in a Belarusian field. And she, his sister, had swum in sunlight. One afternoon, Helen Lambert, the American nurse stationed at Camp Cook, found Ingrid seated on a bench behind the mess hall, staring at nothing. "You missed morning rounds," Helen said gently. Ingrid blinked as if waking. "Yes, I'm sorry, I was thinking," Helen finished. She sat beside her. "That's allowed, you know." They sat together for a while, not speaking. The sound of distant laundry lines snapping in the wind filled the space between them. Then Helen said, "When I worked in Sicily, we treated a boy with shrapnel in both legs. German, maybe 17. When he woke up, he asked me, 'Am I still a soldier if I can't march?'" Ingrid looked over, startled. Helen continued, "I didn't know what to say. I still don't. But I remember that moment more than any battle." Ingrid asked, "Do you believe in forgiveness?" Helen was quiet. "I believe it's not ours to give or to take. It's something that finds you when you're ready to be honest." Ingrid looked down at her hands. "I was proud to serve as a nurse, to help the wounded, to do good work. But now I look at my hands and wonder how much I helped the machine instead of the people inside it." Helen didn't offer comfort. She simply reached out and touched Ingrid's wrist, gently, like grounding a current. That evening, during lights out, Ingrid wrote a letter, not to her mother, but to Hans. "Hans, they say you are missing. I don't know what that means anymore. Are you frozen in some unknown trench? Or have you returned to the sky like the smoke over Hamburg? I fear I will never know. I swam in the Pacific Ocean. I laughed. I felt sun on my back while you carried a rifle through ice. I feel I have betrayed you by surviving kindly. I want you to know I did not forget you. Not for 1 second. If I ever see that water again, I will not ask for joy. Only memory. Only mercy. Your sister Ingrid." She folded the paper and placed it beneath her mattress. It would not be sent. There was nowhere to send it. Weeks passed. Autumn crept in gently, softening the edge of California's heat. More prisoners arrived. Wounded, malnourished, hollow-eyed men from the Eastern Front who had surrendered in North Africa or Sicily. They spoke of burned villages and frostbitten silence. One of them, a young Luftwaffe radio operator, told Ingrid in a whisper that the Allies had reached Aachen, that the war was crumbling. She listened with her hands still, the iodine bottle trembling slightly in her grasp. Dorothy Chen hadn't returned to the camp. But one afternoon, a small package arrived, addressed to Ingrid, marked by censors but unopened. Inside was a book, Leaves of Grass, by Walt Whitman. Tucked into its front cover was a single note. "When I read this, I thought of your eyes at the ocean. Page 43, D." Ingrid turned to page 43. A passage was underlined in pencil. "I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person." She traced the words with her finger. The ache in her chest loosened just slightly. That night, she returned to the bench behind the mess hall. The stars were sharp and still above the wire fences. She held the book close to her chest and whispered, "Let me carry part of it, Hans. Not all of it, just a part." And in the dark, with only the wind to answer, she began to let the guilt settle. Not as a punishment, but as a memory. As a promise to walk forward without forgetting. The ocean was far away now, but its salt still lingered in her skin. And somehow, that was enough to keep her breathing, but its salt still lingered in her skin. And somehow, That was enough to keep her breathing. Then came the telegram. It arrived in December, folded into the trembling hands of the Red Cross liaison, who stood in the center of the women's barracks like a mourner bringing news from another world. The name was read softly, Ingrid Schaefer. She rose slowly, stepped forward, and took the envelope without a word. Her fingers trembled, but her face was carved in stillness. Inside, just 2 sentences. No charmi suarum. Hans Schaefer confirmed KIA, October 19th, Belarus sector. Immediate family presumed deceased following incendiary attacks. Western Hamburg. No further survivors reported. There was no mention of how he died. No grave, no burial, only smoke and absence. She folded the telegram once. Then again, until it was small enough to disappear into her fist. That night, she sat awake on her bunk, watching the shadows move against the barracks wall. Her body did not shake. She did not cry. There was only a hollow sound in her chest, like the echo of a church bell long after the tower had fallen. He was gone. Her brother, her mother, her father, her city. Ingrid Schaefer was the only one left. And she had been laughing in the waves while her world burned. She left her bunk without a word, stepped into the cold midnight air, and walked to the edge of the inner camp fence. No guard stopped her. The moon cast long silver lines across the ground, and in the distance, she could just barely hear the roar of the Pacific, softened by distance and time. There, she sank to her knees. She didn't speak, didn't pray. She simply pressed her forehead to the dirt and let her breathing match the rhythm of waves she couldn't see. She stayed there until dawn. Word spread quickly among the women. Her whole family, they whispered, gone. Some wept quietly in corners. Others left food on her bunk without saying a word. In war, everyone became a silent mourner. Helen Lambert approached her gently that morning. "Come with me," she said. "Just for a walk." Ingrid didn't answer, but she stood and followed. They didn't speak as they passed through the gate into the outer grounds. Helen carrying a folded blanket, Ingrid with nothing but her silence. They walked past the clinic, past the drying laundry, past the vegetable garden where someone had once planted tulips now long since withered. At the edge of the compound, Helen unfolded the blanket and sat down. The wind rolled gently across the hills, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and sea. Ingrid sat beside her, eyes blank, arms crossed tightly. Helen reached into her coat and pulled out something wrapped in paper. "I kept this," she said. "Didn't know why. But now I think maybe I do." She unwrapped it slowly. A small object, metallic, faded bronze. A compass. "It belonged to a pilot," Helen said. "He died over Palermo. He kept this in his boot. I took it from the wreckage. Not as a trophy, just..." She paused. "Just so someone would remember him." Ingrid took it in her palm. It was cold and heavy. The needle still turned. "I don't know where I'm going anymore," she whispered. Helen nodded. "Then maybe let it point you somewhere, even if it's just forward." For the first time in days, Ingrid looked at her. "Forward into what?" Helen's voice was low. "Into life, even if it's broken." Back in the barracks, Ingrid retrieved her journal. She tore out every letter she'd written to her mother, to Hans, to the past. One by one, she burned them in a tin bowl behind the infirmary. Not out of anger, but ritual. Each curl of ash was a goodbye she hadn't been able to say in Hamburg. She kept only one piece of paper, a small card from Dorothy's package. The Whitman line still underlined. "I myself become the wounded person." She wrote beneath it, "Then let me be the one who remembers them all." In the final days of 1944, a list was posted at Camp Cook. names of prisoners being considered for early repatriation under new Allied exchange protocols. A dozen names, all low-risk medical staff, all non-combatant value, all deemed unlikely to pose further threat. Ingrid's name was there. Fifth from the top. She stared at it for a long time. The beach came back to her. The color of the water, the sound of her own laughter, the shame that followed. The nurse's uniform she wore when she thought she could save lives. The dirt under her knees the night she learned she had failed even to remember in time. She didn't feel like someone worthy of returning. But perhaps, she thought, that wasn't the point. Perhaps survival wasn't a reward. It was an obligation. To carry the memory of those who didn't. She signed her name, R. On her final morning in camp, she packed what little she had. A change of clothes, a spoon, the Whitman book, and the compass. The guards helped load the truck with quiet efficiency. No farewells were spoken. In war, silence often spoke loudest. Just before the gates closed, Helen appeared at the loading platform. She handed Ingrid a small tin box. "For the road," she said. "It's just tea, but it's warm." Ingrid took it with both hands. "Thank you for seeing me." Helen's smile was tired. "Be the proof that we didn't all lose ourselves." As the truck rumbled down the coast highway, Ingrid turned her head once. She saw the wire fences fading behind her, and beyond them, the faintest shimmer of blue on the horizon. The Pacific, still there. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Hans, I'm still carrying you." She closed her eyes and whispered, "Hans, I'm still carrying you." The journey across the Atlantic was slow, gray, and cold. The U.S. Army transport ship creaked with every wave, and the women were kept in close quarters below deck, their identities reduced once more to POW exchange. But Ingrid didn't mind the confinement. The sea outside reminded her less of freedom now and more of distance. An ocean that had once carried her away from war was now carrying her back into it. She held the compass at night, letting the needle swing gently in the dark. It never pointed west anymore, only home. When they reached Le Havre, the harbor was a splintered skeleton. Rusting wreckage bobbed along the docks, and burned-out tanks lined the roads like dead beetles. The women disembarked in silence, stepping onto European soil that no longer felt like Europe. It felt scorched. From there, the Red Cross escorted them east by rail. Every window revealed another collapsed town, another field of craters, another line of civilians walking with blankets and kettles, and nowhere to go. Ingrid sat with her hands in her lap, face pale and still. When they crossed into Germany proper, she whispered aloud for the first time since boarding, "This is not the land I remember." An old woman beside her replied, "No, it's the land that remembers you." Hamburg appeared on the horizon like a corpse under fog. Gray smoke still rose from pockets of the city. Even in winter, the air carried the burnt tang of brick and bone. The driver left her 3 streets from her former home. The roads were impassable by vehicle. Ingrid walked the rest. Each step took her deeper into a city that no longer knew its name. Buildings stood like broken teeth. Storefronts were hollow shells, their glass shattered long ago. Churches had no roofs. Streets had no children. At last, she reached the address. Alsterstraße 22. It was gone. A shallow crater remained where the front steps once led. The neighboring structure had collapsed inward, its timbers rotting in the snow. A neighbor she barely recognized, a man missing his left arm, told her the firebombs came in waves that night. "Your mother never screamed," he said. "Just stood at the window, waiting." Ingrid dropped to her knees. She placed the compass gently on the frozen earth, as if laying a flower. The needle spun once, then stilled. She stayed like that until dusk. The snow began to fall again, soft as ash. In the weeks that followed, she wandered through what remained of her city. She slept in temporary shelters and helped at the field hospital where displaced nurses were needed. At first, she didn't speak unless necessary, but the work called her back to life. One day, a boy was brought in with pneumonia. His father had died in the rubble. The child clung to Ingrid's sleeve as she cleaned his wounds. He didn't cry. He only whispered, "You smell like soap." That night, Ingrid walked alone to the Elbe River. The water there was black, slow-moving, choked with debris. Not the Pacific, not even close. But she stood at the edge anyway and opened the small tin box Helen had given her. The tea inside had long gone stale, but she scattered it gently into the current. "Für dich, Hans," she murmured. "And for all the others I couldn't carry." Months passed. The war ended. Germany collapsed, not with one final shot, but with a long, whimpering silence. The flags changed. The uniforms disappeared. The hunger remained. Ingrid stayed. Not because she had to, but because she felt she owed it to the dead. To stand where they had fallen. To rebuild what they had loved. She worked in clinics, washed lice from the hair of starving children, taught young widows how to boil rags into bandages. She spoke little of the beach, of America, of kindness. People wouldn't understand. Not yet. But at night, in the attic of a shared house, she would sometimes run her fingers over the cover of Leaves of Grass and reread that underlined line, letting its truth settle deep in her. I myself become the wounded person, because she was, and so was everyone else. 7 years later, in 1951, a letter arrived from California, postmarked Santa Monica. It was from Dorothy Chen. It read, "Dear Ingrid, it has taken me this long to find the right words. Not because I forgot, but because I remembered too much. After the war, I left journalism, became a teacher, taught history to children too young to carry what we carried. But I never stopped thinking about that day on the beach. About you. I don't know what life has given you since. I hope some of it was good. If you ever return, if you ever find your way back to the ocean, there's a place here for you. No barbed wire, no uniforms, just water. Come back, if only to stand in it again. No guilt, just grace. Warmly, Dorothy." Ingrid folded the letter 3 times and held it to her chest. She looked toward the window, where the wind carried the scent of coal and river mud. She thought of waves, not cruel, not warm, just endless, coming and going, leaving memory in their wake. It would be years before she would gather the courage to return. But in that moment, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she let herself imagine it. The sea again, not as a wound, but as a welcome. The sea again, not as a wound, but as a welcome. It was the spring of 1952, when Ingrid Schaefer stepped off the train at Santa Monica Station, wearing a plain gray dress and holding a single worn suitcase. Her hair, once the pale blonde of youth, was now streaked with iron and salt. Her hands, steady as ever, gripped the letter from Dorothy, creased at every edge, the ink faded but still clear. 7 years had passed since she last walked that stretch of coastline, when barbed wire and rifles had fenced in the horizon. Now there were no guards, no uniformed men standing with clipped orders, just the rush of taxis, the scent of fried onions, and the distant breath of the Pacific rolling like time itself. Ingrid didn't speak to anyone. She didn't need to. Dorothy was waiting near the terminal doors, wearing a pale blue coat, her dark hair pulled back beneath a straw sun hat. She looked older, but not in a way that dimmed her. Her face was still sharp with thought, but the fire had softened behind her eyes. Their embrace was brief but deep. No words at first, just the quiet compression of memory and forgiveness in two pairs of arms that had once belonged to enemies. "You came," Dorothy whispered. "I had to," Ingrid replied. "I dreamed of it too long not to." They walked slowly through the streets of Santa Monica, the ocean always at their left. The town had changed. Cafes had returned. The beach shacks had been painted over in pastel colors. Children ran barefoot in the surf where soldiers once stood. But the smell of salt, of eucalyptus in the wind, and the hush of incoming tide, it was all still there. They did not go to the beach the first day. Instead, Dorothy took her to a small apartment she had prepared. A guest room filled with light, a bookshelf stacked with poetry and history, a kettle that whistled too early. That night, over tea, Dorothy asked, "Do you still carry them?" Ingrid looked down at her hands. "Yes," she said. "But it no longer breaks me. Now it teaches me to bow my head before kindness." Dorothy nodded. "Good, because that's the only thing that's ever changed the world." The next morning, Ingrid walked alone toward the beach. She needed to take the last steps without a guide. She carried nothing. No camera, no journal, no compass. Only a small, folded photograph tucked in her coat. Dorothy's second image of her, taken through the infirmary window, before everything had burned. The ocean came into view slowly. There were no fences, no watchtowers, only the long stretch of sand glistening under morning sun. The Pacific was just as she remembered. Too blue, too large, too impossibly calm for a world that had endured such fire. It almost made her angry again. But instead of turning away, she walked forward, shoes in hand. She stepped into the surf and stopped. The water rose to her ankles, cool and steady. Her skirt clung to her knees. The wind tangled her hair across her face. No laughter, no guilt, just breath. She looked down at her reflection. Older, yes, but clearer. Not the girl who had wept for her brother. Not the nurse who had scrubbed floors in silence. Not the prisoner who had once thought survival was shame. She was something else now. She was the keeper of memory. Ingrid took a deep breath and whispered into the wind. Not for forgetting, not for erasing, but for remembering and forgiving. Behind her, Dorothy had followed quietly. She watched from a distance, giving Ingrid space, knowing this was not a moment to be shared, only witnessed. Then something extraordinary happened. Ingrid turned, walked back to dry sand, and sat down beside a small boy building a crooked sandcastle. He offered her a seashell wordlessly. She took it in both hands, as if receiving a medal. The boy's mother smiled from a beach blanket nearby. No suspicion, no history, just a stranger on a warm day. Dorothy stepped forward and joined her on the sand. "You look lighter," she said. "I left some of the weight in the tide," Ingrid said, still holding the shell. "Just enough." They sat like that for an hour. Two women who had once stood on either side of a war that consumed the world, now watching children play in its aftermath. When the sun began to dip behind the pier, casting long golden shadows across the beach, Ingrid stood. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photo, the one from the infirmary. She let the wind catch it and watched as it danced along the shore, then settled against a piece of driftwood. Let it stay there, she thought. Let it become someone else's story now. She turned to Dorothy. "I'm ready," she said, "to live again. Not because I forget, but because I remember." Dorothy offered her hand. "Then let's begin." They walked away from the waves. But the sound followed them. And in that steady breath of water against land, there was no judgment, only a rhythm older than nations, older than war, a rhythm that said, "You were here, you lived, and you were forgiven." In the weeks that followed, Ingrid Schaefer did not return to the beach every day. But when she did, she went barefoot. No longer as a visitor or as a former prisoner seeking closure, but as someone reclaiming a piece of herself left behind in wartime sand. Dorothy helped her settle into a quiet rhythm. Ingrid took up work assisting at a small local clinic in Santa Monica. Volunteer work, nothing official. She dispensed bandages, brewed tea for elderly patients, and offered silence when silence was what people needed most. The staff never asked about her accent. One nurse, seeing the tattooed number still faintly etched on the inside of Ingrid's arm, and administrative POW code, not a death camp mark, simply placed a hand over her own chest and said, "Welcome home." The phrase struck Ingrid like a soft blow. Home? Was this America her home? Her Hamburg was gone, replaced by bricks and silence and names on plaques. Her family, dust. Her childhood, smoke. But kindness, it seemed, did not care for maps. It moved borderless, unmarked by flags. And sometimes it arrived with a smile and a cup of chamomile tea. One Sunday morning, as she walked along the boardwalk near Ocean Avenue, a man in a wheelchair called out to her. His skin was weathered, his military cap worn and bent. "You're the Kraut from the article, ain't you?" he said, not cruelly, just bluntly. Dorothy had told her this might happen. The old articles never truly vanished, and some people remembered. Some never forgot. Ingrid turned and met his gaze squarely. "Yes," she said. The man looked her over for a long time. Then he gestured to the space beside him. "Then sit. Let's see what kind of German you turned out to be." She sat. His name was Sergeant Alvin Blake. Served in the 36th Infantry Division, Italy, France, and nearly died in the Vosges. One leg gone, 2 brothers buried. "And you," he said, eyeing her. "You got to swim in the Pacific while my buddies froze their asses off in the Ardennes." Ingrid didn't flinch. "Yes, I did." He stared. Then he laughed, a dry, rasping thing. "You don't make excuses, do you? I've lived with silence too long to waste breath on lies." Alvin nodded slowly. "I like that." They talked for an hour. She told him about her brother, Hans, about the telegram, about the guilt that clung like sea salt in every pore. He told her about the day he lost his leg, and how the worst part wasn't the pain, but the pity afterward. "You know," he said, "I used to dream of drowning in whiskey. Turns out, the thing that sobered me up was when a little German kid at the VA clinic handed me a drawing and said, 'Thank you for saving my mommy.'" He laughed again. "What do you do with that?" "You breathe," Ingrid said, "and you try again tomorrow." Word of Ingrid's return began to spread. Quietly, in corners, like a story that people weren't sure they were allowed to repeat. She never stood on a stage, never gave speeches, but she was there, in the background of photographs, helping carry soup pots at church drives, wrapping joints for arthritic neighbors, sharing books at the public library. People asked Dorothy, "Is that really the woman from the POW story?" Dorothy would answer, "She was, and she's more now." It was Dorothy who encouraged Ingrid to write. "Not for them," she said, "for you." So Ingrid did. In a small spiral-bound notebook, she wrote down her memories. Not in sequence, not in chapters, but as flashes. The smell of iodine, the color of firebombs behind closed eyelids, the way guilt felt like wet wool. She titled the notebook, 2 Stunden im Himmel, 2 hours in heaven, a reference to those weekly visits to the beach. Dorothy read the entries in quiet wonder. "This isn't just memory," she said. "It's medicine." One day, Ingrid was invited to speak, just once, at a small veterans gathering in San Diego. Dorothy drove her down the coast. The car was silent for most of the drive. the way people stay quiet when carrying something sacred. The audience was modest. Mostly older men, a few younger family members, some women who had worked in munitions plants or Red Cross posts. No one wore dress uniforms. Some wore oxygen tubes. Others had hands that trembled holding coffee cups. Ingrid stood at the front with her notebook in hand. She didn't read. She simply looked at them and said, "I was your enemy. I was also a nurse. I tried to save lives while the country I belonged to tried to destroy them. Then I was captured. I expected cruelty. I was given a beach. There was silence. Not the cold kind, the reverent kind. I swam in the Pacific while my city burned. For years, I believed that made me unworthy of joy. But then someone told me, you don't have to earn the sun. It shines on everyone." A woman in the second row, her hair thin and white, began to cry. Ingrid finished. "I came back not to ask for forgiveness. I came back to give thanks, to show that kindness is remembered longer than war, and that survival is not betrayal." When she stepped down, the applause wasn't loud. It was steady, like waves. Archer, that evening, Ingrid and Dorothy walked along the beach once more. The sun was low, gold on the waves, the sky the color of apricots. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Ingrid said, "There's one section left." Dorothy looked over. "One?" "In the notebook," Ingrid said. "The last page." Dorothy smiled. "You'll know when to write it." Ingrid nodded. She looked out at the water. Wind brushing her cheek, waves folding gently against the sand. Not as punishment, not as reward, just as the breath of the world, continuing. Just as the breath of the world, continuing. Ingrid Schaefer sat at the edge of the beach one last time, her notebook resting on her lap, the sea stretching before her in its timeless rhythm. She was older now. The lines around her eyes had deepened, and her hands bore the quiet tremor of age. But her gaze was clear, steadier than it had ever been. It was a morning like the one from so many years ago, bright, with a soft wind and the scent of salt and eucalyptus. The same California shore where she had once stood in shock, surrounded by laughter and rifles and guilt. But now there were no guards, no uniforms, just people, living. Children ran near the waves. A father taught his daughter how to float. A woman nearby sketched seagulls with charcoal. Time had softened everything, everything except memory. Ingrid opened Zwei Stunden im Himmel, her notebook of war, of silence, of survival. Every page held a piece of the impossible story she had lived. The hospital ship, the capture, the beach, the journalist, the firebombs, the guilt, the healing. But the final page remained empty. It always had, until today. She took a pencil from her coat pocket. It was short, dull at the end, like a relic. Fitting. She began to write. "This is the last page, and I've waited long to know what belongs here. I once believed paradise was a betrayal, that to laugh in sunlight while others burned was a kind of sin. But I have come to understand. Joy is not the enemy of grief. It is its twin. The Pacific did not wash away the pain, but it made room beside it, and that room became mercy. I carry them still. My mother, my father, Hans. I carry the ashes of Hamburg in the creases of my memory. But I also carry the face of an American nurse who gave me tea, a journalist who laid down her anger, a soldier who listened instead of judging. They were not my enemies, and I was not theirs. I was simply a human being who was told to hate and found something stronger instead." She paused, staring at the words. Then, after a long breath, she wrote, "To those who remember war, may you also remember the moments when the war stopped, 2 hours at a time. May you remember that even in the darkest season, the ocean still offered light, and that someone, somewhere, offered kindness without asking for surrender. She signed it simply, Ingrid Schaefer, nurse, and beneath that, in smaller letters, once a prisoner, now a witness. Oh. Later that day, she handed the notebook to Dorothy. "I think it's time," Ingrid said. Dorothy looked at her, puzzled. "Time for what?" "For you to keep it." Dorothy held the notebook gently, as though it might crack. "But this is your story." "No," Ingrid said. "It's ours, all of ours. Someone has to tell it when I can't anymore." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded, tears caught in her lashes. "I'll make sure they hear it." Years passed. The world changed again. Santa Monica became a different kind of city. Busier, louder, more modern. But the sea remained. So did the stories buried beneath its waves. A museum in Los Angeles eventually asked to archive the notebook. Dorothy donated it, along with the photograph she had once refused to print, now displayed under soft glass. A woman at a window, looking not out, but inward. The exhibit was called Mercy in Captivity. Visitors walked slowly past it. Veterans stood still. Young people leaned in close. A little girl once asked her father, was she a good person or a bad person? The father knelt beside her and said, "She was both. That's what makes her human." Ingrid never returned to Germany. She said she had already buried what needed burying, and the rest she carried with her. When she passed, she was buried near the coast, beneath a modest plaque that read, Ingrid Schaefer, 1916 to 1998, she remembered. Every year on her birthday, Dorothy, or someone else who had heard the story, would leave a shell on her grave. Not flowers, shells, little pieces of the sea. Because for Ingrid, the sea had been the place where the war paused, where guilt and grace met like tides, where enemies became witnesses, where survival no longer tasted like shame, just sunlight and silence and mercy.